In the heart of a bustling city, a moment that seemed like it would pass unnoticed quickly spiraled into a tense and life-altering encounter. Picture this: a white woman, frustrated and fearful, reaches for her phone and dials the police, her voice shaky but determined. On the other side of the phone, a black man goes about his day, unaware that a simple interaction would soon lead to a storm that neither of them could have predicted. The call? A decision that seemed so easy in the moment, but as it played out, would unravel deeper truths about race, fear, and the human condition. This story begins with a seemingly small, yet charged, confrontation. The woman, feeling threatened, made the choice to call the police on a man who was simply minding his business. But in that moment, something changed. What she didn't anticipate was how quickly her decision would spiral out of control, forcing her to face a reality she was not prepared for. As the police arrived, the tension escalated. The man, caught off guard and increasingly upset, stood his ground. The woman, initially confident in her actions, began to feel the weight of her choice. What had seemed like a moment of self-defense soon turned into a moral dilemma, one where the consequences of her fear and quick judgment were now painfully clear. The situation was becoming more than just a misunderstanding. It was a reflection of deeper issues that both parties were unknowingly about to confront. You might think you know where this story is heading, but trust me, it's not what it seems. The woman, caught in a whirlwind of emotions, immediately regretted her decision, but it was too late. Her phone call had set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. The man, his anger now mixed with confusion, began to question not just what had happened, but the deeper meaning behind why it had happened at all. But the real question remains, how would the woman undo the damage? Could she? Or was the damage irreversible? Was her regret enough to make things right, or would the consequences follow her for much longer than she had ever imagined? What happens when our actions, driven by fear or misunderstanding, change the course of someone's life forever? And so, as the police arrive on the scene and the tension between these two strangers mounts, the story doesn't end here. It's only just beginning. Stay with me as we dive deeper into this unfolding drama, where the choices we make, often in the heat of the moment, leave scars we may never have expected. As the woman stood there, her fingers still gripping the phone, she couldn't help but feel a knot tighten in her stomach. The man, tall and broad-shouldered, had been walking through the park, minding his business, when she had felt that flicker of unease. It had started as a slight discomfort, a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. But how could she explain it? He was just walking, just another person passing by. The park was busy, filled with people laughing, kids running around, and joggers moving along the paths. Yet, she felt the eyes of those around her judging her, even though they didn't know what had just unfolded in her mind. Her mind raced as she looked at him, his features, his posture. He was wearing a hoodie, the kind people often wore in the colder months, and his hands were in his pockets. He had a confident stride, but something about the way he glanced around the park made her uneasy. Was he sizing up the area? Was he watching the crowd too closely? These were the thoughts that flashed in her mind, ones she couldn't shake off. Her hand trembled as she dialed 911, the numbers appearing blurry on the screen as she pressed them. The operator answered quickly, and she gave a shaky breath. "I'm in the park. There's a man here. I don't know, I just feel uncomfortable, like he's watching people. He's acting suspicious." Her voice was higher than she intended, but in that moment, it felt like the only choice. She didn't want to admit it to herself, but her actions were driven by a mix of fear, paranoia, and, yes, maybe a little bit of bias that she hadn't fully realized until now. She had never seen this man before, didn't know anything about him. What could he possibly do to her? Yet the fear still gripped her. And that fear was enough to make her reach out for the safety net of authority, hoping that the police would step in and handle it. In that moment, her mind was clouded with a need to feel secure, even if it meant involving others in a situation she barely understood herself. On the other side of the park, the man continued walking, unaware of the ripple effect his mere presence had caused. He had no idea that his casual stroll through the park had been deemed suspicious by someone he had never met. His life, like most others, was defined by a series of moments that felt insignificant at the time but would later become pivotal. Today, this was one of those moments. As he looked at the peaceful surroundings, the sound of children laughing and birds chirping, it all felt normal. He wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, yet something in the air felt off. He'd lived in the city long enough to know that people often judged each other based on appearances, whether it was the color of his skin, his clothes, or the way he carried himself. It had happened to him before, the sideways glances, the uncomfortable stares, the whispers behind his back. It wasn't new. But it still stung every time, no matter how many times he brushed it off. There was something about it that made him question everything. Was he just a figure in the background, someone invisible to society except when it was convenient to stare at him? As he walked closer to a bench near the fountain, he felt a strange sensation, a shiver of unease running through his spine. Was he imagining it, or was someone following him? He didn't want to turn around, afraid that if he did, he'd look paranoid or defensive. But as he reached for his phone to check the time, he caught sight of a woman standing off to the side, her phone pointed in his direction. Her eyes met his for a moment, and he noticed her hand trembling slightly as she gripped the phone. He knew that look. He'd seen it before. The look of someone who was scared, but not of what they thought they were scared of. It was the look of someone who had already decided he was the threat. The thought made his blood run cold. Could this really be happening? Was she calling the police on him? Before he could process what was happening, the unmistakable sound of sirens pierced the air. It was as though time had slowed down. The police were here, and they were coming for him. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest, unsure of what to do next. Should he walk away? Should he wait? Or should he turn and confront whatever this situation had become? His mind raced, but his body remained still, as though he were waiting for the inevitable. The woman, now standing farther away from him, began to retreat slowly toward the trees, her breath quick and shallow. She could hear the sirens getting closer, the noise growing louder, but part of her wanted to run too. She felt her heart in her throat, wondering if she had made a huge mistake. As the police arrived and stopped near the park entrance, she knew that she had no way of taking it back. It had all happened too quickly, and now the whole situation had escalated beyond her control. The police officers emerged from the car, their hands hovering near their holsters, ready for any sudden movements. The woman watched them closely, trying to gauge their reactions. What if they didn't believe her? What if they saw the man differently? Her stomach churned with regret. She didn't want things to get out of hand. She just wanted to feel safe again. The man turned around, his face a mix of confusion and frustration. He could feel the eyes of everyone on him now, on both him and the officers. This wasn't a small misunderstanding anymore. This was real. The weight of it pressed down on him, and he could sense that the air had shifted. The usual sounds of the park, the laughter of children and the calls of birds, seemed far away now. All that remained was the feeling of being judged. The officers approached him cautiously, their expressions unreadable, as if they were bracing for the worst. One of them stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Is everything okay here, sir?" he asked. The man opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to say something, anything, to explain himself, to make them understand that he wasn't the threat they might think he was. But what could he say? How could he possibly get them to see that he was just another person, walking through the park, trying to enjoy a quiet moment? As he stood there, feeling trapped in a web of confusion and fear, the woman watched from a distance. Her eyes widened with realization. She had been wrong. But it was too late to take it all back. The damage had been done. What would happen now? What would the consequences be for both of them? This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It was something far deeper, something that both of them would have to confront, whether they were ready or not. But what would they discover about themselves and each other in the process? That remained to be seen. As the officers stood there, eyeing both the man and the woman, the tension was palpable. The air between them felt thick, like a storm was brewing, and everyone knew it. The officers, trained to handle all sorts of situations, exchanged glances. They had seen this before, people calling the police out of fear, or out of prejudice, or simply out of misunderstanding. But something about this situation felt different. There was a certain weight to it, a deeper current flowing beneath the surface that neither the officers nor the people involved could fully comprehend. The man stood still, his jaw clenched. He could feel the officers' eyes on him, the judgment in their posture. But it wasn't just them. It was the crowd around him, those strangers who had watched everything unfold from the sidelines, silently passing their own judgment. Some faces seemed sympathetic, others uncertain, but there were always a few who looked at him with suspicion. He had learned to ignore them over the years, to push the feeling of being watched out of his mind, but right now, it felt suffocating. He could see the woman now, her back slightly turned but her eyes still on him, her face pale, as though she couldn't believe what was happening. The regret was written all over her face. She had made the call. She had set all of this into motion. The thought gnawed at her. She wasn't a bad person. She wasn't. Yet, deep down, she knew that something was off. She had made a snap judgment, one that could haunt both of them. The officers, noticing the tension, took a few more steps forward, their presence commanding attention. One officer, a woman in her 30s, spoke first. "Ma'am, can you explain what happened here?" she asked, her voice calm, but there was a sharpness to it, an edge that cut through the air. The woman hesitated, glancing at the man, then back at the officer. She took a deep breath, her chest tight with nervous energy. I saw him in the park, and I don't know. I felt uncomfortable. He was acting weird, looking around, watching people too closely. I thought something might happen." Her words hung in the air, too loud, too blunt for the quiet space they had all occupied moments ago. The officer didn't immediately respond, but the silence spoke volumes. The man clenched his fists, his mind racing. How many times had he heard that same line? He was acting weird. What did that even mean? Why was it always him, always someone who looked like him, who had to bear the weight of that vague, loaded accusation? He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the officer interrupted. "Sir, can you explain what happened from your side?" The officer's tone was firm, but there was an understanding in her eyes, as though she was trying to see beyond the surface. He could feel the eyes on him, those of the officers, the woman, the distant bystanders. He had to say something, but what? How could he explain a lifetime of experiences in a few seconds? How could he make them understand that his very existence was constantly scrutinized, that every move he made was analyzed under a microscope, not by those who knew him, but by those who had already decided who he was before he even spoke? "I wasn't doing anything wrong," he finally said, his voice tight, controlled. "I was just walking through the park. I don't know her, and I don't know why she felt the need to call the police on me, but this is not right." His words were firm, but there was a sadness in his voice, a quiet frustration that seemed to echo in the space around them. The woman winced, as though the words stung. She wasn't sure what to say now. The more she heard him speak, the more she realized how little she actually knew about him. She had allowed her own fear to cloud her judgment, and now the reality of that mistake was setting in. What had she done? What was she hoping for when she made that call? To feel safe? To feel in control? She wasn't sure anymore. All she knew was that, in that moment, she had acted on impulse, and it had led to a situation that neither of them could undo. The officer who had been speaking to the woman turned toward the man and asked him to step aside for a moment. "We just need to talk privately," she said, her tone gentle but professional. The other officer stayed close to the woman, who was now visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she fiddled with the strap of her purse. As the man stepped aside, he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him even harder. This wasn't just about an uncomfortable encounter. This was a reminder of the systems in place, of the biases that shaped how people saw each other, how people reacted when they saw a black man walking down the street, or in this case, strolling through a park. He couldn't escape the feeling that he was being treated differently, that his mere presence was seen as a threat when, in fact, he was the one who was now vulnerable. The police, despite their training and objectivity, couldn't help but be affected by the context of the situation, the color of his skin, the woman's fear, the phone call that had already painted him in a certain light. Back with the woman, the officer was asking her to explain what had led up to the call. She stumbled over her words, still trying to make sense of her own actions. I wasn't thinking clearly. He was standing there, and I don't know. I felt like something was wrong. I'm not racist, but I don't know. I just felt scared, and then I called the police." The officer nodded, taking notes, but her gaze never left the woman's face. She could tell that the woman was grappling with the gravity of the situation. "You made a snap judgment," the officer said quietly, almost to herself. "And now you have to live with it." The words hung in the air, and the woman felt the full weight of them. She had called the police on a man, and now she was learning how quickly that decision could turn the world upside down. There was no way to undo it, no way to go back and erase the fear that had clouded her mind. All she could do was face the consequences of her actions. The officers, for their part, were doing what they were trained to do, gathering information, assessing the situation. But underneath it all, they too were aware of the larger issue at play. This wasn't just about two people in a park. This was a microcosm of a larger societal issue, one that wasn't easily fixed with a few questions and a report. The truth was, this moment would stick with both the woman and the man long after they parted ways, each carrying a piece of the tension that had built up between them. But for now, they stood apart, caught in a web of assumptions, misunderstandings, and fear. Neither of them knew what the resolution would look like, But one thing was certain, their lives had already been altered. How they would move forward, whether they would ever cross paths again, remained unknown. The only thing they could be sure of was that the weight of this moment would never fully leave them. The officers exchanged a brief look as they finished taking initial statements. They had been in situations like this before, where a seemingly small incident had the potential to spiral into something much bigger. The air felt charged, every word exchanged carrying more weight than intended. For now, their job was to maintain control, but even they could sense the mounting tension between the woman and the man. Neither of them had spoken directly to each other since the officers arrived, their silence louder than any argument could be. The man's frustration was reaching a boiling point. He had cooperated, answered every question, and done everything to prove his innocence, yet he could still feel the judgment hanging in the air. It wasn't just about this moment, it was about every other moment like it he had endured. His patience was wearing thin, but he knew he had to keep calm. Any sudden movement, any raised voice, could change the situation in an instant, and not in his favor. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to keep his composure. The woman, on the other hand, was crumbling under the weight of her own guilt. Her earlier justifications felt hollow now. The reality of her actions was setting in, and she couldn't escape it. She kept replaying the moment she made the call, trying to convince herself that it wasn't malicious, that she had acted out of genuine concern. But the man's voice, his expression, the way he stood there silently absorbing everything, it all chipped away at her defenses. She wanted to say something, to explain herself, but what could she say that wouldn't sound like an excuse? The bystanders had grown quieter, their murmurs replaced by the kind of heavy silence that happens when people know they're witnessing something significant. Some had their phones out, recording discreetly, capturing the scene from various angles. The man noticed them and felt a twinge of unease. He understood why they were recording, but the thought of being the centerpiece of yet another viral moment filled him with dread. He didn't want to be a headline or a hashtag. He just wanted to live his life without being viewed as a threat. The lead officer stepped forward, addressing both the woman and the man. "Here's what we're going to do," she began, her voice steady and authoritative. But before she could finish, a voice from the crowd interrupted. "Why are you even questioning him? He didn't do anything." It was a young woman, her tone sharp and indignant. She had been watching from the beginning, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her outburst drew murmurs from the crowd, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably. The officer held up a hand to silence the crowd, but the interruption had already shifted the mood. The man turned toward the young woman, his expression a mix of gratitude and apprehension. He appreciated her support, but he also knew how easily things could escalate. The last thing he wanted was for this to turn into a spectacle. The woman who had made the call felt her face flush with shame as the crowd's judgment turned toward her. She could feel their eyes boring into her, their silent accusations louder than any words. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the background and escape the scrutiny. She glanced at the officers, hoping they would defuse the situation, but even they seemed momentarily unsure of how to proceed. The tension was thick now, the kind of tension that made every second feel like an eternity. The officer who had been speaking cleared her throat, regaining control of the moment. "Everyone, calm down," she said firmly. "We're handling this." She turned back to the man. "Sir, do you feel safe here right now?" The question caught him off guard. He hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. Did he feel safe? Physically, maybe. But emotionally? Mentally? Those were different questions altogether. Before he could answer, the woman blurted out, "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I swear, I didn't." Her voice cracked, and tears welled up in her eyes. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and the officers exchanged another glance. The lead officer took a step toward her, lowering her voice. "Ma'am, we need you to calm down," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "You need to let us handle this." The woman nodded, swallowing hard as she tried to regain her composure. But the man's gaze was fixed on her now, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and something deeper, disappointment, maybe, or exhaustion. She could see it, and it made her feel small. Like a child who had been caught doing something she couldn't explain. The officer turned back to the man. "Do you have someone we can call for you? A friend, family member?" The question felt strange to him, almost out of place. He shook his head. "No, I'm fine," he said, his voice steady but distant. "I just want to go home." But going home wasn't an option just yet. The situation hadn't reached its peak, and everyone could feel it. The crowd, the officers, the man, the woman, everyone was holding their breath, waiting for whatever was coming next. The tension in the air was almost unbearable, like the moments before a storm, when the sky turns dark, and the wind goes still. Whatever happened next would determine how this story ended, for better or worse. As the officer prepared to wrap up her questions, a voice broke through the tension, louder and more determined than before. "Wait, I have something to say." The crowd parted slightly as an older man, dressed in a crisp business suit, stepped forward. His presence immediately shifted the energy in the space. There was something commanding about the way he carried himself, his tone brooking no argument. He turned his attention to the woman who had made the call, his expression unreadable. "You didn't tell them the whole story, did you?" he said, his voice low but powerful. The woman froze, her face going pale. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The man in the suit continued, addressing the officers now. "I've been here the whole time. I saw what happened before the call was made." His words hung in the air, each syllable adding another layer to the tension. The crowd collectively leaned in, eager to hear what he had to say. Even the man, who had been stoic and guarded, looked at the newcomer with cautious curiosity. The officers exchanged glances, their professionalism keeping them from showing surprise. "Go on," the lead officer said, her tone neutral but curious. The older man nodded, his gaze never leaving the woman. "Before she called you, there was no confrontation, no reason to suspect anything. He was just standing there, minding his own business." He gestured toward the man, who remained silent but visibly tense. "But then she started acting strangely. She kept looking over at him, muttering to herself. She seemed nervous, like she was working herself up to something." The woman shook her head, her voice trembling as she finally found her words. "That's not true. I thought he was following me. I felt unsafe." Her protest sounded more like a plea, and the crowd reacted with murmurs of skepticism. The older man's expression didn't waver. "Unsafe? You were the one pacing back and forth, glancing at him like you were waiting for an excuse to make that call. I heard you say you were going to make sure they didn't get too comfortable in this neighborhood." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The accusation was sharp, direct, and deeply unsettling. The woman's face turned crimson, her hands trembling at her sides. "That's not what I meant," she cried, her voice cracking under the weight of her own panic. "I didn't mean it like that." But her protests only seemed to deepen the crowd's disapproval. The officers looked at each other, their expressions growing more serious. This wasn't just about one call anymore. It was turning into something much bigger, something layered with implications they couldn't ignore. The man in the suit turned to the man at the center of it all. "I don't know your name," he said, his tone softening, "but I wanted you to know, I saw everything. And I'll back you up if you decide to take this further." The man met his gaze, his guarded expression softening just slightly. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with unspoken emotions. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't completely alone in this fight. But just as the tension seemed to reach its breaking point, another voice cut through the air, trembling with emotion. "I saw it too." A young boy, barely a teenager, stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. His mother tried to pull him back, but he shook her off gently, his determination evident. She was watching him for a long time before she called. "I didn't understand why she was acting like that, but now I do." His innocence gave his words a weight that was impossible to dismiss, and the woman visibly wilted under the scrutiny. The crowd was no longer just observing, they were a part of the story now, their collective judgment pressing down on the woman like a physical weight. The officers, caught between maintaining control and acknowledging the shifting dynamics, were forced to pause and reassess. The lead officer turned back to the woman. "Ma'am, do you have anything else you'd like to share?" she asked, her tone carrying a subtle edge. The woman shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But her words did little to shift the tide. The damage had been done, and no amount of regret could erase the impact of her actions. The older man and the boy's testimonies had turned the situation on its head, casting the entire incident in a new light. The man, who had remained calm through it all, finally spoke, his voice steady but filled with quiet strength. "I don't want this to turn into something ugly," he said, addressing the officers directly. "But this isn't just about me. It's about the assumptions people make and how dangerous those assumptions can be." His words hung in the air, resonating with the crowd and even the officers, who nodded subtly in agreement. But just when it seemed like the situation might de-escalate, a sudden commotion at the edge of the crowd drew everyone's attention. A car pulled up quickly, its tires screeching slightly as it came to a halt. A woman jumped out, her face a mix of panic and determination. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her eyes scanning the scene before landing on the man. "Are you okay?" she asked, rushing to his side. The man looked surprised but nodded. "I'm fine, Lena," he said, his tone softening. The woman, Lena, turned to the officers, her expression fierce. "This is my brother. He's been through enough without people like her," she said, jerking her head toward the woman, trying to paint him as a criminal for no reason. Her arrival added a new layer of intensity to the situation, her protective energy palpable. The woman who had made the call looked like she wanted to sink into the ground. She avoided Lena's fiery gaze, her shame written all over her face. The crowd buzzed with whispers, the story taking yet another twist. The officers tried to regain control, but the scene was spiraling, the stakes higher than ever. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, the air buzzing with a tension that felt almost electric. The officers stepped in, urging everyone to stay calm, but the scene was spiraling beyond their control. Lena, still by her brother's side, clenched her fists, her voice cutting through the noise. "This isn't just about today," she said, addressing the crowd as much as the officers. "It's about a pattern. This keeps happening, and nothing ever changes." Her words struck a chord, and the atmosphere shifted again, the weight of her statement settling over everyone like a heavy cloud. The lead officer nodded, her face serious but calm. "We're going to get to the bottom of this," she said, motioning for her partner to step forward. "Ma'am," she addressed the woman who had made the call, "we're going to need you to provide a full statement at the station." The woman looked up, her face pale and tear-streaked. She hesitated, as if considering her options, but finally nodded. "I'll come with you," she said quietly, her voice trembling. As the officers moved to escort her to their car, Lena turned back to her brother. "You okay?" she asked softly. He nodded but didn't speak, his eyes fixed on the ground. The crowd, sensing the situation was nearing its conclusion, began to disperse, though the weight of what they had witnessed lingered in the air. The older man in the suit stepped forward again, placing a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. "You handled yourself with dignity," he said. "Don't let this define you." But just as it seemed the story was drawing to a close, a sharp voice broke through the relative quiet. "Wait." It was the young boy again, his face flushed with urgency. "I just remembered, I saw her take something out of her bag before she made the call." His words sent a ripple through the remaining crowd, and the officers froze, their attention snapping back to the boy. "What do you mean?" one of them asked, stepping closer. The boy hesitated, looking at his mother for reassurance. She nodded, her expression encouraging, and he continued. "I saw her take out her phone, but before that, she had a paper or something. It looked like she was reading from it before she called." The revelation hit like a thunderclap. The woman, already halfway to the patrol car, whipped around, her face a mask of panic. "That's not true," she blurted out, but her voice lacked conviction. The officers exchanged glances before turning back to her. "Ma'am, is there something you need to tell us?" the lead officer asked, her tone sharp. The woman stammered, her words incoherent. Finally, she broke down, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I was told to make the call. I didn't think it would end like this." The crowd, those who had lingered out of curiosity or concern, gasped in unison. Lena stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "Told by who?" she demanded, her voice like steel. The woman shook her head, her tears falling freely now. I can't say. I was just following orders," she said, her voice breaking. The officers immediately shifted gears, their professionalism taking over. "You'll need to explain this in detail at the station," the lead officer said, her voice firm but measured. As the officers led the woman away, the man and his sister exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of confusion and determination. The older man in the suit stepped forward once more, his face thoughtful. "It seems there's more to this than we realized," he said quietly. "You should be ready for whatever comes next." The final twist left everyone reeling. What had initially seemed like a case of misplaced assumptions and prejudice now appeared to be part of something much larger. The woman's cryptic confession hinted at a deeper, more troubling narrative, one that would take time and effort to unravel. As the man and his sister walked away from the scene, their heads held high, they couldn't help but wonder what else might come to light in the days ahead. The story wasn't over, far from it, but for now, they had taken the first step toward reclaiming their peace and uncovering the truth. The days that followed the incident were a whirlwind of media coverage, police investigations, and community discussions. Video footage from the scene spread quickly online, sparking conversations far beyond the neighborhood. People debated what had happened, dissecting every detail of the woman's actions, the man's calm response, and the powerful show of solidarity from the bystanders. Lena and her brother found themselves at the center of this growing attention, both overwhelmed and determined to use this moment for something meaningful. At the police station, the woman's story unraveled further. She admitted that she had been approached by someone she barely knew, who convinced her to make the call. She claimed she had been offered a small sum of money and told it was part of a social experiment. But her excuses fell flat. Her confession revealed a disturbing plot to create chaos and division, but the investigators pressed her for the names of the people behind it. She hesitated, clearly afraid, but eventually gave them enough information to follow the trail. Meanwhile, Lena and her brother were trying to process everything. They had gone out for a quiet meal one day and returned to a life turned upside down. Journalists knocked on their door, neighbors stopped them in the street, and people from all over sent messages of support. They felt the weight of their story's impact, knowing it had become bigger than just their personal experience. They decided to speak up, not for fame, but because they realized their voices could inspire change. At a community forum organized a week later, they stood before a packed room of familiar faces and strangers alike. "What happened to us could happen to anyone," Lena began, her voice steady and strong. "But what we saw that day, people coming together, standing up for what's right, gives me hope." Her brother added, "We have to stay vigilant, not just against these blatant acts, but also against the subtle ways prejudice creeps into our lives." The forum wasn't just about their story. It was also about the broader issues the incident had highlighted. Activists spoke about systemic bias, local leaders pledged to improve community relations, and attendees shared their own experiences. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of frustration and determination, but it felt like a step forward. As the investigation into the incident deepened, the police uncovered evidence that supported the woman's claims about being coerced. Text messages and phone records revealed a network of individuals involved in orchestrating similar situations across the city. Their motives were unclear. Some speculated it was a twisted attempt to go viral, others believed it was part of a more insidious agenda. Either way, arrests were made, and charges were filed. The revelation shocked the community but also brought a sense of justice. For Lena and her brother, life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. They continued to share their story, not out of obligation but because they knew it resonated with people. Schools invited them to speak at assemblies, local businesses offered support for initiatives promoting unity, and social media platforms featured their journey as a story of resilience and hope. They never sought the spotlight, but they embraced the opportunity to make a difference. The woman who made the call faced legal consequences but also entered a restorative justice program. Part of her sentence involved meeting with Lena and her brother in a mediated setting. She apologized, her voice heavy with regret. "I know I can't undo what I did," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But I want to understand the harm I caused and do better." The meeting was tense but necessary, and while forgiveness didn't come immediately, it planted a seed for healing. Months later, the neighborhood looked and felt different. People who once avoided eye contact now greeted each other warmly. A mural was painted on the wall of a local community center, depicting a scene of unity and strength. The artist, a teenager inspired by the story, said it represented the power of standing together against hate. Lena and her brother often walked by the mural, reflecting on how much had changed. "It's strange, isn't it?" Lena said one evening as they stood in front of it. "What started as such an awful day turned into something important." Her brother nodded. "We didn't choose this, but we chose how to respond. That's what matters." The story eventually faded from the headlines, but its impact lingered. It became a case study for police training, a topic of discussion in classrooms, and a reminder for everyone in the neighborhood to look out for one another. For Lena and her brother, it was a chapter in their lives they wouldn't forget, a painful but transformative experience that showed them the strength of their community and their own resilience. As they moved forward, they carried with them a sense of purpose. They knew the world wasn't perfect and that challenges like the one they faced would continue to arise. But they also knew that people could come together to make things better, one step at a time. Their story had started with a call to divide, but it ended with a call to unite, a reminder that even in moments of darkness, light can emerge when people stand together.